Hi, I'm Danny and these are my Diecast Disasters. In this video, I'm going to be making a rat rod out of a Hot Wheels custom Volkswagen Beetle. This is a cool little model produced by Hot Wheels from 2007. This is one of the 2019 versions. The other version has a similar ratted out sort of style. But hopefully we can make a better looking rat rod than this. The first step is to drill out the rivets holding the car together. Once these are drilled out, I can take the model apart. The first thing I do is to cut the bonnet off of the car. I do this with my rotary tool, but you could also do it with a jeweler's saw or a hacksaw. The wheels and axles are going to get in the way, so I pop them out. I've used a file and some sandpaper to smooth down my cut. The paint is removed by painting on some poly stripper. A few minutes later, the paint wrinkles and peels away from the casting and is easily washed off with some cold water. I use a wire brush on my rotary tool to clean up the casting, removing any remaining paint and any oxidation. The first step in giving the car a rusty, ratted out appearance is to paint it with some rust effect paint. This looks okay, but it isn't a very interesting rusty surface, so I'm going to add some more shades. I start with a light rust wash. Next I apply a darker wash unevenly around the model to create some lighter and darker areas. I spray on a thin coat of matte varnish over my rust. I want to have a heavily worn out and chipped paint effect over my rust. I'm going to achieve this with some salt. I start by applying some water where I would like the rusty patches to be. Next I apply the salt to the model, using the water to stick it where I would like the rusty patches to be. I'm using rock salt, which I've ground up so there are some larger and smaller pieces of it. While the salt and water application is drying, I use some thinner to thin out some teal coloured paint for my airbrush. I gave the car 2 coats of this teal paint. Once the paint had dried, I used an old paintbrush to brush away the salt. This takes the paint away with it, allowing the rust to show through underneath. Next, I apply a little bit more rust effect paint carefully here and there. The roof rack and cut section at the front are painted silver. I next apply some rust effects to the silver areas. I add a very thin rust wash around the window frames. I also streak it down like water runs in the odd areas. The roof rack is finished with a black wash. To finish the body, I apply a very small amount of metallic weathering powders around the metal areas. I also added some light dust weathering powder around the wheel wells. This was all finished with a satin varnish. I'm going to use the motor off of this diaper dragger. To allow for the motor, I'm going to cut off the front section of the interior. I don't need a motor sticking out of the back, so I cut this and the pipes off of there as well. So here is the front end that I have fabricated. I've put the motor from the diaper dragger on there, also a grill from another car, some radiator pipes, a small bumper, and I've also re-drilled the axle hole higher so that it lowers the front of the car. I added a couple of small pieces of aluminium tubing to the rear axle hole to push the rear wheels out wider. Some epoxy putty was used to fill the redundant rivet hole in the base of the car. I then airbrushed the whole interior section and motor in gunmetal. The steering wheel and seats were painted, and then I apply a dark wash over everything bar the seats. These will get a lighter wash after the first darker one has dried. With the washes dry, I apply some weathering powders. If you notice, I also used a round burr on my rotary tool to make little dents in the end of each exhaust pipe. This looks a little bit more realistic than the rounded ends with casting lines on them. I finished the base and interior with a satin varnish. And here are all our parts painted and ready to go back together. I'm going to use these street style mags. Before we take a look at our assembled and finished rat rod, let's take a moment to be reminded of what we started with. A cool little custom V-dub Beetle with its own red rat rod kind of thing going on. But it's not really ratted out enough to be considered a diecast disaster. And here is our finished product. A much more realistically worn and weathered, ratted out little Beetle. Some lucky person found this old beat up Beetle in a barn somewhere, chopped the front off, threw in a big new engine, and she's ready to go. This was a really fun project to make and a very satisfying result. It's probably one of my favourite customs I've made. With 2 versions being released this year, these little V-dubs are easy to get your hands on, so maybe you could try making your own rat rod. Time to take it out for a hoon to an old warehouse and do a photo shoot. I'll now take a moment to welcome all of my new subscribers and say a big thanks to everyone for the great comments and likes on my videos. Thanks heaps everyone. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters Dan and Rob. Thanks heaps guys. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can check out my Patreon page. I'll leave a link in the description below. Thanks heaps for watching. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe.